views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
We've seen it play out so many times before. An unarmed man dying at the hands of police. Protesters now going across America seeking justice in the death of George Floyd. We know there are conversations that need to be had. Conversations about race, conversations about police brutality, conversations about community. Where do we go from here? That dialogue continues right here on Perspectives with yours truly, Daren Jaime.
What's on your mind? Express what's on your mind. What's on your mind?
Anything relevant to life, you bring it to the table. Whether you make a move solo or a movement with a stable. No fables, just speak on your decisions. Cause in the long run, it's your voice, your views, your vision. Keeping it real with many messages for you to know. This ain't radio, but DJ runs the show. Entertainment, he rocks it. Politics, he locks it. The host with the most would handle any topic. Don't forget to share your perspective with shines of light. Cause it might make a difference in someone else's life.
Make a difference in someone's life. Express what's in your heart and your mind. Share your perspective.
What's your perspective? Let them know.
And hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Perspectives. I am Daren Jaime, and of course, we thank you for watching. As always, you can watch Perspectives every week here on BronxNet's Channel 67. If you have Verizon Fios, that would be Channel 33, or anytime on the web at bronxnet.org. We, of course, encourage you to stay connected to us at all of our social media platforms, and I also encourage you to check me out on Facebook, Daren C. Jaime. That's the professional page where you can get information as well as some inspiration. Well, we're going front and center on the show again, talking about the lead story that's taking place across America. Protests in the wake of the death of George Floyd. And as we talk about George Floyd, we're talking about discussing race and race relations in America, including the death of George Floyd, but not just George Floyd. If you remember other names such as Amadou Diallo, names such as Trayvon Martin, names such as Eric Garner and Sean Bell, and the list can continue to go on. And so we've got a very special panel of guests that will share with us today and weigh in on the conversation about both race, these protests, and where do we actually go from here. First is Dr. Juhanna Rogers, and she's a critical race scholar who's been exploring for years on the intersection of race in America. She's a strong voice and an activist who continues to build platforms, as well as having these conversations about race, justice, and also equity. Dr. Rogers continues to use her voice and a national, international experience, motivating and educating Black and also brown leaders in order to create change in their communities as well as professional spaces. We talk about Black and brown, not just Black and brown, but also white and Caucasian, right? Also joining me, retired NYPD detective Marq Claxton. He is also the director of the Black Law Enforcement Alliance, and he's also been committed to civil and human rights and criminal justice reform. He's been seen on many platforms as a contributor, MSNBC, CNN, you've seen him around, but we're pleased to have him here on the platform of Perspectives. And thank you both for sharing with us.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yes, and so as we're talking about this right now, we're looking, and America continues to reel from these protests. We've got a president that seems very out of touch with the population. And so, Dr. Rogers, let me talk to you first as you begin to share a little bit about your sentiments about what we're seeing in the street. Because in one conversation, I told people the feeling is not enough is enough, but now the feeling is almost enough is beyond enough.
Oh, my goodness. I have felt such a sense of anger and such an overwhelming sense of obligation to act in ways that move beyond where I've been doing the work within the arts community, economic development community, just advocating as a scholar in different communities. Now feels like a time for me and many of the folks that I'm engaged with to push is is the only way I can think to describe it. so many times folks like myself, which I'm describing myself in this moment as someone that has a seat at the table, the professionals that are inside corporations and organizations, I was really struck by the arrest of Omar Jimenez on live television last Friday, that it shook me to my core, the rage that I was feeling. And it made me question, what else do I need to be doing right now? The young people, we got a diverse range of people that are in the street, not just in New York or Minneapolis, but across the world at this point, that are outraged at what's been happening in our country, not just this last 6 months of 2020, but for over 400 years. And I think where we are is at beyond the boiling point in addressing that, when we see in just 1 week after dealing with such a profound health crisis, the killing of George Floyd, the actions of Amy Cooper, and then the arrest, it's just too much. It's just too much.
Let me bring Marq in, and let me ask you, Marq, your thoughts. I mean, obviously, America had the opportunity of watching on video the death of George Floyd, a knee to the neck for minutes. And you're watching an officer, as an officer, a retired officer, looking at that officer. What were you saying and what were you thinking?
I think my reaction was the same reaction so many people have, and same as Dr. Rogers has had and expressed. And that's this visceral kind of anger, frustration, pain. And really not just for the singular event and the death of Mr. Floyd, but because of the historical injustices that Black and brown people face and continue to face. And it just seems as if there's very little relief in sight for us. And what we're finding now on the street, much of the protest, not all of it, but much of the protest is just an expression of the anger and the frustration and the need to demand better, the need and the desire for our professionals, our law enforcement professionals especially, to show humanity, have an understanding of the predicament and condition of Black and brown people across the nation. But on top of that, have empathy and show humanity, if nothing else. And that's frustrating. On a professional level, as a retired detective, a police officer, what I witnessed there was an embarrassment and a blemish that will always remain on law enforcement. And it wasn't just the actions of the one individual police officer whose knee was actually on Mr. Floyd's neck, but the cowardice and the failure of 3 other police officers who had a duty and an obligation to intervene. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. Whether you're a police officer or not, there's a point in which your humanity has to kick in. And they failed. And what they didn't do showed their cowardice.
Yeah, Dr. Rogers, as you began to think about and unpack the events that surrounded past that, of course, we've got protests. We've got people taking to the streets. And I want you to, for a minute, put a little bit of context to this, because we're talking about George Floyd. We're talking about protests. But what we haven't spoken about is people are taking to the streets in the middle of COVID-19. And what does that say for people who are literally risking their lives to raise their voice?
Yeah, I think my mom joked with me earlier yesterday. As I went out with my son, she's like, remember, COVID is still out there. But right now, I think many people are making the decision after watching what has transpired over months and the impact on the health system and on our real lives when we think about who is being impacted in really, really significant ways. The conversation started yet again, the African-American, Latino community, the urban community, how the unemployment rates again are deeply impacting our folks, because many of the industries that have been shut down and not able to work from home are jobs that we typically hold. When we talk about when people are having challenges getting the unemployment needed and necessary, people are worried about their rent and utilities and being able to keep their kids fed and don't have the technological resources to keep their kids engaged in schools. We're talking again about the Black and brown community. And what we have on our hands is what I've called a perfect storm. A perfect storm where scholars like myself has continuously talked about not just the existence of racism, but critical race scholarship talks about the way that attitudes and behaviors around race are embedded in our systems, the healthcare system, the juvenile justice system, the police system, all of these attitudes and years of inadequate treatment, inadequate access, inadequate advocacy for our experiences and the truth that's rooted in our experiences because of perceptions and stereotypes of race that extend from slavery forward is all brewing up right now. And so, you know, when I think about what needs to happen, we need the protests in the streets, but we also need folks inside organizations that are sitting at tables like myself, like Marq, like yourself, to be pushing boundaries around the conversations, but also the policy to back up what needs to happen when it comes to deploying more equitable resources to people that look like us.
And can I ask?
Yeah, I want to get into this. I'll get Marq. Go ahead.
And it's interesting what Dr. Rogers said about the systems that exist. Part of what you're seeing in the demonstrations and a lot of the vocal criticism are people who are demanding reform from these systems, because they're at the point now where they question whether or not, some would say the systems are broken. And now people are saying, I don't know if the system is broken or the system is constructed to work in the way in which it is working. So now we have to really demand beyond quote unquote fixing the system, reforming the system, modifying the system. And there are some quote unquote extremists who say, let's just abolish the systems. That's the on the street conversation and action that's going on right now.
And I 100% echo that sentiment, Marq. 100%.
Yeah. Let me take a quick break and come back and talk more. Great conversation. We'll be back with Dr. Rogers, Marq Claxton. Our topic of conversation, of course, the death of George Floyd and the protests across America. You're watching Perspectives with Daren Jaime. We'll be right back right after this. And we're back here on Perspectives. Daren Jaime here with you as we continue our conversation surrounding race, America, the protests following in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd at the hands of a Minneapolis, Minnesota police officer, Derek Chauvin, subsequently has been charged with second-degree murder, along with 3 other officers who face the same charges. And America, even though the charges have been filed, have still been asking questions. Our guest, if you're just joining us, Dr. Juhanna Rogers, as well as Marq Claxton, retired NYPD officer. Let me start with you, Marq, about this. I got in some trouble this week in terms of a challenge, because I saw somebody had actually made a post in regards to the NYPD, and it was about Terrence Monahan, the highest ranking officer of the NYPD, and him actually taking a knee with protesters, and you had people within the rank and file, or this person wasn't in the rank and file but wants to be a police watchdog, called him a clown. And there are others who are inside the department who felt as though that was wrong. I'll throw in another situation. We talked about COVID-19, and we talk about communities of color. And so when we talk about the pop-off, if you will, with communities of color in New York City, one of the things that the questions are with regards to social distancing. We saw Orthodox Jews receive no sanctioning for not social distancing. But in communities of color, real intense harassment and more arrests. And so, yeah, it's a powder keg. So I guess my question to you is, first of all, was Chief Monahan wrong in kneeling with protesters? And secondly, talk to us about the NYPD and that gap.
I think in regards to Chief Monahan, the pushback that he's received is a result of the police culture, if you will, in large part. You can take issue with tactically whether you believe that it was smart or wise for him to kneel down in the middle of an ongoing event, if you will. That's one aspect that people are dealing with. But the reality of it is the objection of so many of my former colleagues is based on the police culture, which is always wants to create this wall. It's us against them. And you never mix with the thems under any circumstances. Chief Monahan quite clearly was attempting to bridge a gap and to fill a void and to kind of mitigate some of the damages of conduct that professional law enforcement commits and has committed historically. That was his attempt, and that should be praised and honored and respected. In regards to the enforcement of Black and brown people, it is consistent, once again, with police culture. If there is an additional enforcement or a new law or a new regulation or a pilot project, Black and brown communities will be the petri dish. And they will receive the heaviest enforcement. They will be monitored and charted and used, the statistics used there for the efficacy of whatever practice or policy that law enforcement wants to engage in. That's just how it is. Because unless you understand that, you would have to believe that Black and brown people violate social distancing more, smoke more weed, drink more liquor out in the street, cross, jaywalk, speed, run red lights. You see, the enforcement in Black and brown communities is disproportionate. And it bastardizes the very statistics that they use to continue enforcement.
Absolutely. And that,
Dr. J, I want to ask you if you would just share a little bit about this, because when we talk about the enforcement, right, and you talk about being a seat at the table, you got one side that's out there in the streets that are protesting. You got the other side that's not in the streets, but are really at the table trying to work on policy. What kind of policy could we be looking at? Should we be looking at? Should we be trying to have enforced to create a different kind of narrative for what we see?
Oh, you want to take me to school now? I have a couple of ideas. First, the allocation of resources. And many of these organizations, and I'm thinking about my hometown in the city of Newark right now, right, where the mayor and people are talking this positive narrative about how Newark is protesting and demonstrating in a very peaceful way. And when we look at what happened in the city of Newark in 1966, 67, around the riots and protests, the city and the community, right, after white flight, it's a very Black and brown community that polices itself. Of course, there's issues that arise because I think of the Fraternal Order of the Police, but we were able to come back from that and work in alignment with one another to address the representation of Black and brown people in that community in a different way. If we use spaces like that and as a model for what it is that has happened and how it is we got to that place and space, I think that gets us on a page. I also think when it comes to companies and institutions, what their evaluation, what their review process, what their policies look like when it comes to rethinking how they evaluate certain things. So Marq, he brought up, you know, how the Black and brown community is a petri dish when it comes to testing new approaches to police activities or monitoring certain things. So of course that community is going to be overrepresented. The numbers are going to look slighted. And when we look within organizations, we need to do that same type of work. What are across New York State, again, MWB access certification policies to get revenue in the hands of Black and brown businesses? How do we revamp that? How do we ensure that that certification process is upheld and that it moves more systematically, especially in the time of COVID where people have been out of work? We're fearing the disproportionate representation of Black and brown peoples to be underfunded, to be not brought back from jobs. And what are we going to do proactively to address that issue? Because that was an issue before COVID and it's going to be a huge issue afterwards, right? And so we need those proactive measures that's looking at resource allocation, process and improvement within organizations, standing up more committees or positions within organizations and give them the power and resources to evaluate and make changes when it comes to diversifying and building equity structures that yield more diverse returns around the presence of people of color within some of our leading organizations. So it's not just me at the table. There are multiple professional individuals of color that are standing up at all tables across different types of organizations, for sure, is what I think we need to do.
Yeah, Mark, let me jump in here. The elephant in the room is this. I'm sitting here talking to Marq Claxton, NYPD officer. He's sharing his thoughts. He's sharing it quite openly. You know, he disagrees with the system. And let's be honest, that doesn't always happen. Mm-hmm. And we don't find that. So talk to me about, first of all, why you're so adamant and so vocal. Second of all, give us a little bit more of a perspective of African-American communities of color that actually work in law enforcement, and why is it so hard for them to speak out when you have issues such as this, which are blatantly obvious. And I must admit, I was very, very much surprised to watch the chief of police in Atlanta, a white woman, actually speak and come down and be very vocal about this. It doesn't always happen, but also here, just give us a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, I think people have to realize that part of what occurs when you join these different law enforcement agencies as a Black person, Black and brown, is that you come from a particular culture. You may come from a particular culture and you may have a particular perspective and understanding of these social events and these political social dynamics. And then you join these law enforcement agencies. The tendency is, and this isn't universal or absolute, but the tendency is that you become subsumed, if you will, by the police culture, and you then put all your life experiences, etc., on the back burner. You see, you become more, quote unquote, blue than who you actually are. And your actions then become more based on police culture than anything else. And that's what happens. That's the culture of policing that is detrimental, and it's antithetical to individualism. And there are individuals, and I would hope that throughout my career, I'm retired now, but throughout my career, you know, I assumed certain positions based on if I felt they were the right or just thing to say. And I've attached myself to organizations and individuals who felt the same way. But we have to be careful. Don't always assume, like many people do in some of these reform ideas, that all we need are more Black and brown people in these positions and things will be well. Oh no, the police culture has a stranglehold on a lot of offices, whether it be Black or brown or other. Now, in regards to
let me jump in, take a quick break. I'll let you finish your point when we come back. They tell me I gotta take a quick break. I'll be right back.
Yes.
And we're back here on Perspectives. Daren Jaime here with you. Our guest, Dr. Juhanna Rogers, as well as Marq Claxton, talking about the death of George Floyd and the protests that have followed. And what about America's situation with race and race relations? A lot to talk about. But Mark, I cut you off before the break. Go ahead and finish what you were saying.
We were referencing some of the law enforcement professionals that we've seen over the past week or so who have publicly and openly expressed support for the prosecution of these Minneapolis police officers involved in the death of Mr. Floyd, and how unusual this is. As a matter of fact, I would dare say that this has never occurred, not at this level. Across the nation, you have Black, white law enforcement professionals, many of them running agencies who've demanded the arrest and the prosecution of these police officers. And that is a good thing. But I want to caution folk that the real question when the rubber meets the road will be in about a month or 2 months from now, whether or not the humanity and the compassion that they feel and their clear-eyed thinking about police and police function and whether reform is a good idea, whether or not they will have the same feelings and sentiments 2 months from now. Or will the police culture snap back in and bring everybody back into the place where it's us against them? And I think it will be the latter. And the reason I say that is because I've heard even some politicians who have had decades-long opportunities to create support foster significant and substantive police reform, and they didn't do it, this week come off as being progressive. So I'm very suspicious of that. It's a good thing. It's a positive move forward, but I'm very suspicious of it.
Dr. Rogers?
I think the thing that, and you're 100% Marq, we have to be careful of the photo opportunities, the immediate gut reactions. We've seen over and over again, if you look back at incidents that have happened, the immediate responses without the long-term impacts. And right now, what I'm interested in seeing is show me your work. I want the long-term impact strategies. They just announced, even as us sitting here on this call, the mayor of LA, I believe, is reallocating $150 million from the police department into Black and brown communities. What does that mean? Right? We can't just allow folks to roll out what feels good at the moment. And this is to my point about like push back and be at the table. We have the young people and the diverse audiences in the street, and they need to push. We need to be asking for clarification. We need to be asking for the alignment of resources with the people that know how to implement things that are going to be beneficial to the entire community, and not get caught up in things that we've got caught up in before with aligning just with one organization or one person because they tend to be the expert in its areas, and make sure that things are dispersed equitably across communities. And then ultimately, we got to figure out how we're going to make it to November with the craziness that's happening at a federal level as far as leadership concerned, which again, at this moment with the perfect storm brewing, we need to think about long-term impact, and that's going to be about voting from a local to state to a federal movement around that, and pushing people to think about their choices for an election.
Yeah, a lot to think about. Listen, got just about a little bit under a minute left, a minute for each of you. Give me your thoughts. Marq, what do we see from here? I mean, obviously the big thing is not about the arrest. It's really about conviction. What do you think?
Yeah, it is about conviction. It's about holistic prosecutions, not just arrests. We've been here before, not just putting them through the system. We've been here before. But I want to alert people, just as something that Dr. Rogers touched on just now, that we can look for other departments and other jurisdictions to begin the conversation about divesting from law enforcement, defunding police. And we have to be careful about that, but that's a conversation I think that many people are beginning to have across the nation.
We have a number of companies, Target, all these entities that are stepping up and saying they are putting money towards the Black and brown communities in various ways. What does that mean, and what does that look like? And then again, policy change and shifts, and that happens and starts where we are. Everybody has the potential to go out tomorrow and speak up. And if we got young people in the street willing to get tear gassed and engage with the police and put their lives on the line at this moment, then those of us that are out there but also sitting at tables, we got to be willing to give something up too.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both for a very lively conversation. We can continue this for another half hour, literally. And we have to probably bring you both back so that we can continue to follow it. I mean, literally. I mean, I know a good show when the show goes quick. This is an important
conversation.
It really is an important conversation, and really, I'm glad that we can laugh, because the truth of the matter is, it's no laughing matter. But we can laugh. I mean, we can laugh about the fact that we can sit here and talk all day about this, because guess what? These issues have been going on for a long time. But I have a special feeling about what's happening right now. I don't know about you, but that's my special feeling. But thank you both for coming and sharing with us here on Perspectives. That about wraps it up for this edition of Perspectives. I am Daren Jaime. Of course, we thank you for watching. And most of all, we encourage you, stay connected. Share your perspective with somebody else. You never know. It just might make a difference in somebody else's life. Stay connected to me, Daren C. Jaime on Facebook, DC Jaime 23 on Instagram and Twitter. And we will get you connected, and we'll share with you some multiple perspectives so that you can be able to be informed. Take care. We'll talk to you soon. And God bless.